Hello, everyone, and welcome to Proselytize or Apostatize. I am one of your hosts, Caleb Jackson, and this is my co-host, Travis. How are you doing, Travis?
Hey, doing great, Caleb. Super stoked for this episode. Really looking forward to kind of delving into this negative theology. I know Samuel's kind of sent me some literature to read on it, and it's very fascinating. So I'm super pumped for this episode.
Yeah, and Travis just transitioned that way. So here's our guest, Samuel Watkinson. Samuel, do you want to just introduce a little bit about yourself, what your interests are, what you've written about and worked on, etc.?
Sure. So I'm a 23-year-old theology student in Wellington, New Zealand, who has studied history. So this doing my second degree in theology, focusing on biblical studies and historical theology. So I'm interested in, well, a lot of things really. I'm quite an eclectically minded person. So I'm interested in biblical studies, like you, Caleb, particularly the New Testament, although I've studied Old Testament papers as well. I'm also interested, I've become more interested due to the influence of David Bentley Hart, an Eastern Orthodox theologian, in Eastern Orthodoxy for one, but also just philosophical theology, or we could say the relation between philosophy and theology and how they, for a lot of history, they've been not separated into two separate disciplines, but been so intertwined, right? So apophatic theology, which we're going to talk about today, is one of those topics which has a philosophical origin in a lot of Platonism, but it has been appropriated by a lot of Christian theologians, right? We'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, so that's just how this topic relates to my interests in general. Unless you wanted me to say something else about anything, how it's personally related to me or anything like that.
No, I think that was great. Yeah, no, we really appreciate that. Yeah. Now, so just for the audience knows, due to scheduling conflicts and because for those who watched the show recently know that I'm currently on missions work and stuff in New Jersey, I will only be able to be on here till 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so about 15 minutes. So Travis is going to be doing most of the show with Samuel, but that's great. I think they're going to be a great pair, and it will do it. But we are going to get right into it just for time's sake. So yeah, I think the first question everyone's wondering is, so what is negative theology, or is it apophotic or apophatic? That's what Wikipedia said. So so I guess explain to us what exactly that means for like the lay people who may be watching.
Sure. So I think I just want to have to break down the word. So in Greek, you have phasis is the general Greek word for speech or for talking. So you have like an English word like aphasia, which is like a kind of disorder, if you will, which signifies the loss of the brain function to do with the governs speech, right? So it means you can't speak that well. So that's, and then if you combine phasis or speech with apo, which is a preposition, you probably know this kind of apo in Greek means away from, or just, I mean, it can mean from, but it means away from. So apophasis literally means away from speech. And it's usually contrasted with kataphasis, which means towards. At least it's one meaning of kata, the prefix in Greek, the preposition. So there's many ways that you can go away from speech, though. You know, one of the most common ways is through denial. So through by saying something and then denying it, saying no to it, right? And this is why another common word for apophatic theology is negative theology. You know, or in the Latin tradition, it's called the via negativa, the negative way, right? Particularly in Aquinas. But that's only one way of going away from speech. Another way is through just saying less and less. So you're not actually, to the point where you're just silent. You're saying nothing, right? And yet another way is if you use language that kind of undoes itself or subverts itself or points attention away from itself. So like, and this is probably the most appropriate one that I think is the most important to understand apophatic theology. So you have a lot of Greek church fathers up until, and then beginning with them, but also going up to like to Aquinas, right? So they use in Greek they'll use the alpha privative, so a as the negation of something. Well, as I said earlier, aphasia means negation of speech, right? Or in Latin, it would be like the prefix im, or in. So if we say, just to use Latin because it's easier in English. So if we say that God is invisible, I mean not visible, invisible, or immutable, not mutable, immortal, not mortal, not does not die, right? So these are, or inaccessible is another one, common one as well. So yeah, these are examples of words which kind of subvert themselves or point away from. So if you want to say that God is immortal, you're pointing at once you're pointing to something mortal that dies, but you're saying it's not that. God is not mortal, right? So yeah, so that's hopefully a simple way to explain a lot of what apophatic theology does. And one other thing I'll just add, in defining it, is it's important to clarify, is apophatic theology is not just about using negative words. So, because negative words aren't necessarily always better. So this is why in apophatic theology you have what's called the negation of the negation. So what, so like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a 6th century Neoplatonist Christian who lived in Syria, he often uses this idea of the negation, which basically means that God you negate that which you negate. So you're moving away from both positive or cataphatic language as well as negative language. So you're saying that God is neither. Which so the point of this is not to be in a to self-contradict yourself, to say nothing. The point is just is to acknowledge that God is God. God is not anything creaturely, or and therefore cannot be conceptualized or spoken of in creaturely terms. But that obviously raises the question of how can we know God and all that. But if you wanted to, you can ask that.
Yeah, I think that was going to be the next question, because it seems like I've heard atheists say that if you say God has no limits, and
Sure.
How do you know what properties does God have? How can he even exist if you just say he just doesn't have so and so? Right? And I guess the second one you said is cred too, of I think almost all the arguments for God are somewhat analogical. We see something and we make an inference to say, right, everything has a cause. God is the first cause. We're comparing God to other kinds of causes, but we say he's a bit different metaphysically. So if God's not really comparable, then how can we still be reason to believing that there is a God? How can we live a personal relationship with God? And I guess the third, I don't want to add too many questions, but because I'm limited time, I'll throw in the last one.
Sure.
Is it because of this impersonality that God may have desired to have the incarnation in the first place, so that he could relate to humans in a more down to earth way? So I guess those are thoughts off of my head. If Travis wants to add anything,
I'll let Samuel respond to that. That's quite a bit.
Yeah, sure. So I'm trying to think where to begin. So it's true that this raises the question of what about the incarnation and how does this relate, to God? But this is actually what most church fathers. This is what made the incarnation more special for a lot of the church fathers. So once you establish that there is a God who is essentially incomprehensible or unknown, which is what we find in Acts 17, when Paul's talking in the Areopagite, he said, that to the unknown God, right? So I think this is a good way to do apologetics or to do Christian theology is like you begin with where people are, you know. I'd say begin with philosophy. So begin with establish. This is what Aquinas is essentially. So he begins in the second question of Summa, establishing God's existence through 5 ways. You're probably aware of these, right? And then in the next question, which is on the simplicity of God, Aquinas says this. He says, when the existence of a thing has been ascertained, there remains the further question of the manner of its existence. You know, in what way does it exist, in order that we may know its essence. But because we cannot know what God is, but only rather what he is not, we have no means of considering how God is, but rather how he is not. And then he says, therefore, we must consider how God is not. Right. And then he goes on to, you know, talk about how God is not a body, he's not composed of matter and form, essence, nature, etc., etc. All of these dualisms that characterize creatures, right? So the reason why I mentioned Aquinas there is because he doesn't. I mean, he firstly, it's important to note, he believes it's important to establish God exists. You know, so the important thing for people like Aquinas is we know that God exists, but we don't know how he exists. So it's a really important distinction. So it's not like we're in the dark completely without, you know, Christ's revelation. We can establish a lot of things, if only analogically, you know, in a kind of dim, darker way, right? But the crucial thing is that we can't know God's nature, so what he is. So in Latin, this is quid est. You know, it's a way to establish the nature of something. I mean, I can go into more detail if you want, but basically, it's just. This is also why Aquinas doesn't think God is a part of a genus. You know, is because a nature in the medieval terminology was defined by a genus and a differentia or species. So you have a genus and then you have specific individuals that fall under that genus. But there's no genus under which God falls. So it's not like there's a genus called divinity and then God is the highest of that genus, you know. God is in a completely different, he's beyond all genuses or any kind of idea of that. So yeah, I don't know if that's somewhat helpful, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I like it. So I was thinking, like in the incarnation, would you say that, you know, it could be viewed in such a way, you know, that God is just so immensely transcendent that he can become a human, live amongst us, and things of that nature? Well, kind of like, you know, he can reveal parts of himself, you know, in like certain dimension, you know, that he's just so immensely transcendent that, you know, it would kind of work that way. I'm wondering if that might be a way we could look at it through apophatic theology.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly how certain apophatic theologians like Pseudo-Dionysius, who I mentioned earlier, account for the incarnation. They say that because creation is already a theophany, a manifestation of God, the incarnation, the idea of the incarnation, the idea of God condescending and becoming a human, so the is but a specific mode of what we already observe in the world, which is that the world is a manifestation of God's nature, right? What the incarnation does, though, in addition to just manifesting God, is that it gives God a human face, right?
Yeah. That
makes it more personal, right?
Yeah. So, you know, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm going to ask one more question right before I hop off, and then you can go, Travis. I don't interrupt you. I'm actually asking this for some of my other friends watching who are very big, who are more theistic personalists, so I don't know if they would agree with you there. But they would. I guess my question would be: so I know there are certain philosophers like Richard Swinburne, who I'm assuming is not going to be in that the camp that you're describing, who would say that we can predict what God would do. We can assume that a perfect being would become incarnate, would atone for sins, etc. And that's how they get something like the resurrection. Do you think with this theology, can we make predictions as far as what God will do in the world or how he'll create, or is this more we cannot simply know? And does that hurt that kind of methodology for apologetics?
It's a good question.
It is.
I wouldn't want to phrase it myself in terms of predictions, because I don't think they're really predictions. They're postdictions. They're after the fact. Rationalizations in a sense, which doesn't make it illegitimate inference. I'm not saying it, but I'm just saying it's yeah. I don't think it's really a prediction in the proper sense, but the idea behind what Swinburne's getting at, I kind of agree with. So like what I take to be the idea is that we have evidence through natural theology, some kind of evidence of what we might expect God to do, but at the same time we can't completely predict, because God is not us, and so there has to be an element of surprise, of unexpectedness to the revelation, right? But it can't be so unexpected and so surprising that you can't account for it based on your background experience of what you already know God is, right? Based on natural theology. So I think there's some intuition that Swinburne's getting at that I agree with. I just don't agree with the terms in which he puts it, because I don't think of God as, I don't think it's wise to think of God as some personal agent whose activities we can predict in any kind of measurable way.
And to be fair, I think that I don't know if Swinburne actually, it's been a while since I've read the book. I don't know if he actually uses the word predictions, so that could just be my sloppy phrasing. But yeah, I think that's a good answer regardless. So I do have to half off now, but I'm going to give this to Travis now, and I trust that he will lead this well. So have a fun conversation, guys. I will definitely finish watching it when I have the time. So peace out.
Good. All right. Take care. Yeah. So Samuel, one thing I was wondering is, with apophatic theology, why do you think it's important? Like, why is this like a good way to look at God? As what do you think is important about it as far as that's concerned?
Well, gosh, there's so many things like I say here. Well, I mean, firstly, just
like your
question,
top couple of reasons of why you think it's like, why you hold to it and why you think it's important. Maybe that people, they have this view of God.
Sure, I'm just trying to think of who your audience might be, because some people might ask, "Oh, is it biblical?" It's the first thing they think about. Is there any biblical basis for saying this sort of thing? Even if there's,
Well, perhaps a better way to ask the question might be like, what do you think are some issues with, like, some contradictory views? Like, let's say, like theistic personalism. Like, what are some, do you think other views are problematic, whereas this is more, a better model of God?
Sure, we could get to that in a second. Maybe I'll just begin with just answering your question about why this is important.
Okay, yeah.
So, like, I just give an example of so one of the key texts that a lot of the apophatic theologians have used, so from Gregory of Nyssa in his Life of Moses to Pseudo-Dionysius in his Mystical Theology, is the story in Exodus about there's two kind of related stories in Exodus. So you have Moses in the burning bush, right, where God reveals his name.
Yes, I am that I am.
Yeah, and then you also have when Moses ascends the mountain, and he well, I might just quote a little bit of it to see and know what I'm talking about. So let's see if I can find where. But basically, yeah, he gives 10 commandments, and then there's a meeting between God. It's described as taking place in a thick cloud or smoke, and then thick darkness, right? And it's out of that darkness that the revelation comes of not about God, but about ourselves and how we should live, right? Now, I'm just trying to think how to talk about this. Hold a second.
No problem. And for the viewers, Saturday, we have a great episode coming up as well with Tim Howard of Invoking Theism. We're going to be discussing metaphysics, various arguments in the philosophy of religion. So you definitely want to check that out coming up on Saturday.
So I'm just trying to think of whether it'd be helpful to actually talk about how Dionysius speaks of this episode.
I mean, we could, or if you want to just move on to a different question. I don't want to stump you or
yeah, no, it's fine.
I didn't mean to,
No, I know. I'm just trying to find the passage I'm thinking of. So,
by the way, we have Ethan of Spartan Theology with us. Hey, Ethan, glad to have you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So maybe I won't quote it all, but I'll just quote some of it. So he says,
yeah, go for it.
In the mystical theology, it is not for nothing that the blessed Moses is commanded to submit first to purification and then to depart from those who have not undergone this. When every purification is complete, he hears the many-voiced trumpets. He sees the many lights, pure and with rays streaming abundantly. Then, standing apart from the crowds, he pushes ahead to the summit of the divine ascents, and yet he does not meet God himself, but contemplates not him who is invisible, but rather where he dwells. This means, I presume, that the holiest and the highest of the things perceived with the eye of the body or the mind are but the rationale which presupposes all that lies below the transcendent one. Through them, however, his unimaginable presence is shown. But then he, Moses, breaks free of them, away from what sees and is seen, and he plunges into the truly mysterious darkness of unknowing. And here, renouncing all that the mind may conceive, wrapped entirely in the intangible and the invisible, he belongs completely to him who is beyond everything. Here, being neither oneself nor someone else, one is supremely united by a completely unknowing inactivity of all knowledge, and knows beyond the mind by knowing nothing. Now, I realize that might be slightly convoluted for some people initially to comprehend.
Well, but, you can break it down for us.
Sure. But basically, it's kind of a way to say that I'm trying to think how to put this. Well, he says that there's a kind of a darkness of unknowing, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the darkness that this is probably the key, most important thing to understand. So I'm sort of lost for words, and quite ironically, because the point of Apophatic theology is you're sort of lost for words and speak of God. But
hey, it fits. You're consistent.
I guess the most important thing to stress is that this darkness of unknowing, the reason why it is a darkness is because there's an excess of light, not because there's a lack of knowledge. So, when we speak of agnosticism, so we speak of someone's agnostic, they lack knowledge, they don't know, right? Whereas what Dionysius is saying here is that because there's an excess of light, there's so much light, then when you stare at the sun, you become blind, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Right, and that's kind of what he's saying. The reason why I was trying to think, I was trying to relate this to there's Plato's allegory of the cave, you're probably aware of, in the Republic.
Yes.
Yeah, he speaks of how the one of the prisoners who's locked to the wall and who has never seen the light of the day, he goes out and then sees the light of the good. But when he sees it, his eyes, they can't really comprehend. And so when he goes back into the cave to rescue those who are still there, they require a lot of training. They initially are angry. They're like, how can you claim that you are more enlightened? Because they are in the dark or in the shadows, right? But yeah, yes, I'm not sure if that's helpful. So yeah, the most important thing, I guess, is just that when people like Dionysius, they speak of an unknowing. There's another author called anonymous author in the 14th century called the Cloud of Unknowing, which is actually based off this this phrase in Dionysius. But what this means, this cloud of unknowing, it means just that there's a knowledge of God we have, which informs us that God is beyond anything that we can know. And that's why it undoes what we know and points away from what we're saying, right? So in Greek, there's actually a distinction between ignorance, agnoia, where we get agnostic, and agnosia, which is just the negation of gnosis. So you probably heard of the word gnosis or gnosis in English, which means not knowledge, right? And then agnosia is just with alpha private, it's a negation of that knowledge. But usually, and this is important, if we want to get into like other issues like impassibility and sort of thing, is that the alpha privative, that the a as the prefix, for agnosia, it doesn't mean just negation. It means a kind of beyond. It's kind of a taking up of the knowledge into a higher state. And so if we speak of, and this is why, just to give a parallel example, so when we say that God is impassible, we don't mean that he's unemotional or like a rock who can't
right. And I kind of hear that charge a lot towards classical theism, but
right. But so apatheia or apatheia, if you pronounce it, is the equivalent of impassibility, impassible. It means a negation of pathos, and pathos in Greek is the passions. So if the passions are a particular kind of emotion that the ancient and the medievals thought was a lower animal aspect of a human.
Yes.
Right, and so it's not as it's not rational. So they're not rational or proper emotions to have, and that's why we have this idea that God is apatheia or does not have pathos, not because he doesn't like care or because he's unemotional, but because he is he transcends all the limitations of pathos. So pathos is inevitably, in our experience, something that limits us, constrains us. Yeah.
So it's a form of God having rational emotions that are, and I think we have to bear in mind the sense that God is just so transcendently beyond us. Yet interpenetrates too, and the way we would look at God is as far as his relation is through him having rational emotions, not like you were saying the passions of of like lower human nature.
Right.
All right. What are some what's some pushback or some arguments to the contrary of this that you've heard, and how would you respond? Are there? I mean, do you get a lot of pushback with apophatic theology?
Yeah. But
I mean,
it's
I can
usually
think
by
of a few
people.
people who would probably push back.
It's usually by people who don't really. It's not just that they haven't really studied or even looked at apophatic texts or apophatic theologians, but they don't really care enough to look into it. And so one of the most common objections, which is really the worst, is how can you say that God is ineffable if you're saying that if you still speak of God? Is that so self-undermining or self-contradictory?
Right.
But this is actually serious. This is you can find a semi-sophisticated version of this objection in Alvin Plantinga's Warranted Christian Belief, which people like Ryan Mullins have taken over into their own work. But it's really not just
we can get into
it's not just
that too.
Yeah, it's not just a bad objection, but it's one which the many apophatic theologians are already aware of. They're not stupid. They don't. People like Augustine and Aquinas, they're not so stupid, so unintelligent to make a self-contradictory statement. I mean, I'm not that they're infallible necessarily, but I'm just saying, if you're trying to claim that all of these very eminent theologians have just constructed a whole theology that is self-contradictory. You need to be charitable to them. Try to understand why this might not actually be self-contradictory if you understand it properly. Now, so I'm just going to quote this passage from Augustine's De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, where he actually says he's quite aware of this objection. So he says this. So speaking of the Trinity, and then he says, have I spoken something? Have I uttered something worthy of God? No, I feel that all I've done is to wish to speak. If I did say something, it is not what I wanted to say. How do I know this? Simply because God is unspeakable, or ineffable is the Latin word there. But what I have spoken would not have been spoken if it were unspeakable. For this reason, God should not even be called unspeakable, because even when this word is spoken, something is spoken. So he's aware of this. So there's a kind of conflict between words here. If what cannot be spoken is unspeakable, then it is not unspeakable, because it can actually be said to be unspeakable. It is better to evade this verbal conflict silently than to quell it disputatiously. And then this is how he responds. He says, yet although nothing can be spoken in a way worthy of God, he has sanctioned the homage of the human voice and chosen that we should derive pleasure from our words in praise of him. Hence, the fact that he is called God, or Deus in Latin, he himself is not truly known by the sound of these two syllables. Those two syllables meaning Deus, the Latin word, it's two syllables. He himself is not truly known by the sound of these two syllables. Yet when the word Deus strikes our ears, it leads or uses the Latin language to think of a supremely excellent and immortal nature. Right. So the way that Augustine responds to this is by saying, it's not contradictory to say that God is ineffable, because to say that God is ineffable is only to kind of guard against what we can't. There's kind of a how do I put this? A logical grammar of God talk. Imagine like a gate which you can't trespass beyond without going beyond your creaturely capacities. So basically what Augustine is saying is that we can still use words of God, but we just need to recognize that all words, all ideas infinitely fall short of describing or referring to God and his nature. So once again, going back to Aquinas, we know that God is, we know that when we use the word God, there is a reality to which we are referring, but we don't know the exact nature, what God is, because God is so unlike anything we can ever experience in the world. God is supposed to be, this is what Brian Davies, for example, often emphasizes, that God is supposed to be the answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. But the answer to the question of why there's something rather than nothing cannot be a something. It cannot. Another way to put this is, in the creeds, the Apostle Creed speaks of the maker of heaven and earth. The maker of, the maker cannot be the maker of all things cannot be one of those things. He has to necessarily be infinitely beyond that which he produces or creates.
Right. So he's just so. Would you say that apophatic theology it's really crucial on focusing in on God's transcendence, or no?
Yes, but once again, I would invoke Aquinas' language of analogy, because so there's this famous line in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which would be canonical for Catholics, but at any rate, it's important. So where the line is, we cannot note any similarity between God and creatures without noting an ever greater dissimilarity between the two. Right. So this is often the basis for what's often called the analogia entis, or the analogy of being, which I'm hopefully going to talk about with John Depew next week. Debate with him about it. But basically, what this line means is that it sanctions us to note similarities, to say that God is, or to say that we are like God in some ways, but we can't. It's not as legitimate. Or at least we need to be more careful when we say the opposite, that God is like us. So there has to be some kind of asymmetry, because the producer is not like the produced. However, the producer is revealed through the producer is revealed in the produced. Does that make sense? So the nature, So there can't be a complete disjunction or asymmetry. Or dissimilarity, but there has to be on the end of the cause, the ultimate cause, there has to be a asymmetry, because God is I mean, this is a kind of, just logically just makes sense, the cause of anything in our experience, the cause of some effect in our experience, in some way imparts itself to it, but it is not completely like it. Like, it's just, and otherwise, if it did, then it would be completely like itself. It would just be a duplication of itself, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I know, like when you first, sent me that literature on
Yeah,
negative theology. One way I kind of thought, and I'm sure it's the analogy. It's a weak analogy, but when I look at it kind of geometrically, like let's say you have like a flat two-dimensional plane, right? And then you have something just like a third dimension that has that extra depth dimension that could interrelate within that 2D plane, and so that 2D plane is going to be like the 3D, interacting with it in insofar as it's interacting with it. But the part of the 3D, like the depth dimension, would be incomprehensible from the second dimension. So, I mean, that's kind of the way I looked at it, like using geometry. I think, it's kind of a bad analogy, or it's just a natural analogy, but I think it kind of helps to explain a little bit or to
yeah,
think better.
sure. Yeah, another analogy which might be helpful is one that Aquinas uses in the fourth question on the perfection of God. So the last article is on whether any creature can be like God. And then Aquinas obviously cites, Genesis 1 about let us make man in our image and likeness. And then at the end of, so his response to the last objection is he says, although it may be admitted that creatures are in some sort like God, it must in no wise, this is pretty much what I was saying before, it must in no wise be admitted that God is like creatures.
Right.
For as Dionysius says, Dionysius in the Divine Names, chapter 9, he quotes him, he says, a mutual likeness may be found between things of the same order, but not between a cause and that which is caused. So that's what I was saying earlier about the producer and the relation between the producer and the produced. If the producer is of a completely different order ontologically than the produced, then there can be, in principle, no similarity, or at least from the end of, to say that God is like the creature. But there can be the other way. You can say that the creature is like God, but you
Right.
Firstly, right? Sorry, let me just finish what Aquinas says. So he says, this is the last sentence. He says, for we say that, this is the analogy, for we say that a statue is like a man, but not conversely. So also a creature can be spoken of as in some sort like God, but not that God is like a creature. So yeah, so the analogy he briefly gives in a few words is that of a statue. So a statue is like a man, but it is not a man. It's an image. And this is an appropriate analogy, actually, because you probably know how the ancient Near Eastern background to the language of Imago Dei or Zelim Elohim, the Hebrew for the image is an idol in a temple, or statue, right? And so, yes, it's a helpful analogy to demonstrate that we incarnate God's presence as idols, as idol icons of God. But we are not, or we do not fully reflect incarnate God.
Right. And
Right.
I've noticed this kind of tends to be an area where, like, I like a lot of like you're coming new atheist objections to theism, and like some lay level objections you'll hear. You'll notice it doesn't take this kind of conception of God into account, and kind of presupposes a very very much a theistic personalism.
Sure. Yeah.
And everything. So I think this one thing I think is that this way of thinking about God and it is really helpful, and I think it's really powerful. And because you'll see like a lot of these common objections, like well, God is just like Santa Claus or something like that. Well, he's not a being among other beings. He's the source of all being. So I think it's really helpful in that regard.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think what our fellow theistic personalist or neoclassical theist, if we want to use the term that they prefer, how they would respond to this kind of thing. I feel like it's difficult to explain to both atheists and these theistic personalists why it's important to not think of God as a person to begin with. It's difficult because it's just so natural in our experience to, if we want to say that God is personal in some way, that we can relate to God, then how can we relate? In our experience, we can't relate. How can we relate to something that's not a person? Well, at least the relationship would not be symmetrical, would it? It would only be. This is why the bad kind of caricature of God as like a stone or a rock, who can't be moved, is used, because they think that we can interact with the stone or the rock, which is an analogy for God, who can't be moved, but God can't be moved by or affected by us. But the problem with this is that they don't realize that when we say that God is immovable or impassible, cannot be affected or moved by us, the only reason why we say that is because everything in our experience which can be affected by another thing, like us, we are affected by other human beings, we are affected by other things, right, is finite or limited. And this is a limitation. I don't think people see how this is a limitation, and I think that's probably why they still feel like it's appropriate to think of God as in some ways reacting to humans. So so this is why you often think of a lot of, this is just a common kind of conservative evangelical narrative of the gospel of salvation is, you have God who creates everything good, and then sin enters the world, but then God responds or reacts to this fallen world, and then becomes incarnated in the person of Jesus. And so, but it sounds nice, but but is it? Firstly, is it true? But also, is it appropriate to think of God as a being who reacts in the way that we react to a situation? So we encounter some situation, and where we realize that things are going bad, and we're like, okay, let's intervene and try to fix the situation.
Yeah.
Do you want to think of God like that, or rather, I think more appropriately, you think of God as someone who, or as that reality, who is absolutely unchanging and immutable, and who cannot. This is biblical.
Right.
How God does not change. Micah, that verse in Micah,
and I'm thinking, not to over psychologize, but do you think this might be a tendency that, we're human creatures who experience length, width, height, and time? That's all we know, think, feel, or can even imagine in. And so, God would obviously transcend length, width, height, and time. He's eternal. He's, he's not bound by our spatio-temporal dimensions. And so I'm wondering if it's just a natural human tendency to kind of put God into terms of length, width, height, and time, and that he's like us and everything, when he would be so much more transcendent. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it is what these people unconsciously do, or either consciously or unconsciously do, is that they present God as in some ways different or dissimilar to humans. So they'll say that God is a necessary being, for example, cannot fail to exist, or that what else would they say? They'd say that God's purposes are unchangeable, at least, if his nature is not. But so I've just lost the question you're asking.
Oh,
that's what was it again?
Basically, we as human creatures,
Oh yeah, spatial temporal. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Do we want to kind of not
Mhm.
like totally, obviously not totally, but like we tend to kind of portray God in this like 4-dimensional box essentially that we're in.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, that's the personalist route. Or it can kind of be a tendency to, not that all theists are personalists do, but it's kind of a human tendency to kind of do that.
Sure. Yeah. So what I was going to say was that while theistic personalists would say that God is not like us in some ways, like he's a necessary being, whereas we're contingent, right? They would. The reason why they're still compelled. Oh, sorry. I was going to say they are still compelled to speak of God in many ways is similar to us. And the reason why is because it's just we can't imagine anything existing that is non-spatio-temporal. Like it's hard to do, but just because it's hard to do, it doesn't mean that you should just reduce God to a spatio-temporal being who is, a necessary being with all these attributes, omnipotence, omnibenevolent, etc. I just think it's a mistake to conclude from the fact that it's incomprehensible or hard to imagine. It's difficult to imagine for us as creatures, to conclude from that we not just we can, but we should represent God as if he were some spatio-temporal being. So even if we say that God is not a spatio-temporal being, so just to try and steelman, these personalists.
Right.
So they might want to
straw man.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to either. At least I'm trying my hardest not to. So they would want to say perhaps that God is not like a spatio-temporal being in the same way that we are spatio-temporal beings. Not in exactly the same way, at least. But they're still representing God as if he were a spatio-temporal being. I mean, and then you see this unambiguously in the way that they speak of God, as in as I mean people like Ryan Mullins, they literally say that God is temporal. I mean, not just in time, but
I was actually going to bring that up. They would say that time is an attribute of God.
Sure. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Apophatic theology would very much deny that.
Well, actually, we would affirm it in some senses. Actually, this might surprise some people, but so there's actually people can read this later if they want, but so in Pseudo-Dionysius, one of the Apophatic theologians I mentioned earlier, in his larger work, so not the mystical theology which I quoted from earlier, but he has another larger work called On the Divine Names. And in that work, we have a chapter, I think it's chapter 10, on the names of God Almighty, the Ancient of Days. We find in like Daniel 7. But in that same chapter, he also discusses the names of eternity and time. And there's a sense in which we can call God time or day, or all these temporal words. But it has to be in a divinely appropriate way. So in a way which it doesn't say that God is constrained or affected by the limitations of time, right? So he says, it's only a few sentences. He says, God is celebrated as Ancient of Days, since it is eternity and time of all. Yet God is before every day and before every eternity and time. Nevertheless, God must be called time, day, due time, and eternity in a divinely appropriate way, which is what I just said. Thus, God is unmoved and inaccessible in its every motion, abiding in itself and always being moved, and is cause of eternity and time. So what he's basically saying here, to break it down in simple words, is that God is not contained, but God is in some senses in time or in temporal things, but he is not contained by it, because God is both before and beyond. So these are two
right. So it would very much, would you say that it very much would transcend like created time, the way we experience time?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah. So Dionysius, that's what's going to add. It's important to note. He says God is both before and beyond both time and eternity. So even our notions of eternity.
Interesting.
God is beyond that even. And the reason, I don't want to get into technical detail about Neoplatonist conceptions of time, but
another episode.
Sure. One immediate reason is because, in this context, is because he wants to distinguish between beings like angels, who we can say that are incorruptible or eternal in some higher sense than us.
Right.
But God is not. So this is what he says: for the writings, the scriptures, do not everywhere call what is eternal that which is absolutely ungenerated and really eternal. They give the name eternal to what is incorruptible, immortal, unchangeable. So what Dionysius is saying here is there's a distinction between eternal in the sense of incorruptible, the way in which angels, or even us, we will become like the angels, as Jesus says. We will become eternal in this qualified sense of eternal, but the real eternal, the most unqualified or absolute sense of eternal, is what ungenerated. In Greek is agenetos. So it's the word that was used in the Trinitarian controversies. We are not ungenerated, and of course the angels are not either, because they were created, right? And so this is one area where the definition of eternal is different to a lot of modern analytic discussions of eternal. You'll see. So they don't make these distinctions between different senses of eternal. But we can talk about that another time if you want. But
yeah, that's super interesting. We're kind of coming up on the hour mark. Are there any things you would like to say before we close out?
No, not really. I could recommend some books that people want to read.
Yes, absolutely. You've sent me some material. That's one thing I think would be really helpful, like for the audience checking this out. Maybe where can they kind of learn more about this and really look into it.
Sure. So the first book I'd recommend, partly because it has a first section on the biblical roots of apophatic spirituality, which a lot of your listeners might be interested in, is this book by Janet Williams called Seeking the God Beyond, subtitled A Beginner's Guide to Christian Apophatic Spirituality. So she's called J.P. Williams in academia. So if you just search J.P. Williams Seeking the God Beyond, I think you can find a Kindle version for pretty cheap, and also a normal version. But that's a book I'd recommend because it has a really helpful bibliography at the end of it, which has reference to other books that I would recommend, such as Dennis Turner's The Darkness of God, which is a good classic on this topic. And also because, this might be of interest to every single person of your audience, but what Janet Williams also does is she compares apophatic spirituality and the Christian tradition with certain parallels we can find in other traditions, and her focus is on Zen Buddhism.
Oh,
so
interesting.
because Zen, they have this idea of the don't know mind,
Right. I think of like, yeah,
which is kind of similar to the unknowing that I was speaking of earlier, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, I would recommend that just because it not only goes through like the history of some of the main figures of apophatic spirituality and the Christian tradition. So people like, so there's 4 main figures, and I haven't mentioned all of them so far in the episode, but the ones she mentions, and these are the ones I'd highly recommend everyone read. So Gregory of Nyssa, who is a 4th century theologian, one of the Cappadocian fathers, who's important in forming Christian orthodoxy. So he's not a heretic. He's very orthodox. Also a universalist, by the way, but that doesn't make him heretic, interestingly enough. So he's the first guy, and then you have Dionysius, or the Dionysian corpus, which I've quoted from. And Meister Eckhart's another author who's part of the Dominican order, so he's kind of a bit after Aquinas, but the same kind of school in a sense, but it's more apophatic than Aquinas. And then lastly, you have Nicholas of Cusa, who was a 14th century, 15th century German theologian. So yeah, I mean, yeah, once again, get the book if you want more details, but I think people would, it's really well written and a delight to read as well. It's not like dry reading at all. So I think people would enjoy that particular book.
All right. Sounds great. And Samuel, it was super great having you on. Really enjoyed it. I think this is a really fascinating topic that you can just like get so like deep into, and I really think it would be good, for those in the audience to look into this more. I think it, like, for me, it's really helpful in how I worship God. Like, my conception of God affects how I worship Him, and everything. So I think this is a crucial doctrine, and I actually am really enjoying reading on it myself. And so we really appreciate it. And coming up Saturday, we'll have Tim Howard of Invoking Theism on, discussing metaphysics and certain arguments within the philosophy of religion. So everyone will definitely want to check that out. And with that, I am signing out. Take care.